The manor stood on a hill above the small village of Ashbourne, its gray stone walls cold even in the warmth of summer. For 30 years, the people of the village had whispered about the Duke's son, the boy who vanished one autumn night, when he was only 4 years old. Some said he had wandered into the woods and been taken by wolves. Others said the old Duke himself had ordered the child sent away, fearing some dark prophecy about the boy's future. No one knew the truth. No one except a servant girl named Mary Whitfield, who had been 12 years old on the night it happened, and who had carried the secret in silence for 3 long decades. Mary was now an old woman, her hair white as snow and her hands trembling with age, but her mind remained as sharp as ever. She lived alone in a small cottage near the edge of the Ashbourne estate, having served the Duke's family for more than 50 years before she finally retired. The current Duke, a man named Edmund Hawthorne, was the nephew of the man whose son had disappeared so long ago. He had inherited the title only because there had been no direct heir left to claim it. Edmund was a stern man, fair in his dealings with the village and his workers, but he carried a heavy weight on his shoulders, a question that had never been answered, a shadow that hung over his family name, like a storm cloud that refused to pass. It was a cold morning in late October, when a young man named Thomas Carow arrived in Ashbourne. He was about 30 years old, with dark hair and storm-gray eyes, the very same eyes that had once belonged to the old Duke's missing son. Thomas had grown up far away, in a small fishing village 200 miles from Ashbourne, raised by a kind couple who only told him the truth as they lay dying. They confessed that he was not truly their son by blood. They had found him as a small child, wandering alone near the rocky coast, unable to remember his own name or where he had come from. Out of pity and love, they had taken him in and raised him as their own, never once speaking of his mysterious past. For years after learning this truth, Thomas searched for answers about his real family, but every path he followed led nowhere. It was only by chance, while passing through a busy market town, that he overheard a traveling merchant telling a story about the Duke of Ashbourne and the small son who had vanished 30 years before. Something about the tale struck a deep chord within him, a strange and powerful feeling, almost like a memory trying desperately to rise up from beneath dark water. With little more than instinct to guide his steps, Thomas decided to travel to Ashbourne and see the great manor for himself. When he arrived in the quiet village, Thomas took a small room at the local inn and began asking gentle questions about the Duke's family history. The villagers, however, were wary of strangers who asked about such matters, and most of them refused to speak openly. But the innkeeper's wife, a kind elderly woman with warm eyes, finally told him that if anyone in Ashbourne knew the truth of what happened all those years ago, it would be Mary Whitfield, the old servant who had worked in the manor during the time the boy disappeared. Thomas found Mary's small cottage tucked at the end of a quiet lane, smoke curling gently from its chimney into the gray autumn sky. He knocked softly on the wooden door, and when it finally creaked open, the old woman stared at him for a long, silent moment before her face turned pale as the morning frost. She did not speak right away. She simply stood there, staring at him, as though she were looking upon a ghost from her past. "You have his eyes," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "You have the very eyes of the boy I lost." Thomas did not understand what she meant, but he gently asked if he might come inside, and she allowed him in, her thin hands shaking as she poured them both cups of warm tea. She sat across from him at a small wooden table, and after a long pause to gather her courage, she began to speak. Her voice trembled under the weight of 30 years of silence finally being broken. She told him that on the night the boy disappeared, she had been the young servant tasked with watching him, while the household staff busily prepared for a grand dinner the old Duke was hosting that evening. She had been only 12 years old at the time, inexperienced and easily distracted, and she had left the small boy alone in the nursery for what she believed was only a few minutes, just long enough to fetch him a warm blanket from another room. When she returned, however, he was simply gone. She searched every corner of the manor in growing panic, but there was no sign of him anywhere. She had been terrified to tell anyone the full truth, fearing she would be blamed for his disappearance and dismissed from her position, or worse, accused of something far more serious. But what she had never told a single soul, not even the men who searched the dark woods for weeks afterward with torches and dogs, was that she had seen a carriage leaving the estate grounds that very night, traveling fast down the narrow coastal road under the cover of darkness. She had recognized the driver as a man who worked closely for the Duke's younger brother, a man named Richard Hawthorne, who had long resented his older brother's title, his wealth, and his position within the family. Mary had been far too afraid to speak of what she had witnessed, knowing that accusing a powerful member of the family without solid proof could cost her everything she had, perhaps even her own safety. In the years that followed, Richard Hawthorne grew steadily more powerful within the family's affairs, quietly managing the estate's finances while the old, grieving Duke slowly withdrew from public life, his heart broken beyond repair. When the old Duke eventually passed away without ever finding his beloved son, the title passed naturally to Richard's own line, and many years later it reached Edmund, the current Duke, who was Richard's grandson, a man who had inherited not just a title, but an old, unanswered mystery. Thomas sat in stunned silence as Mary finished telling her long-held secret. Then, slowly, he told her his own story in return, how he had been found wandering near the coast as a small boy with no memory of his past, taken in by a loving fishing family who raised him with kindness, but never spoke the truth until they were dying. As the two stories intertwined, the pieces of a 30-year-old puzzle began to fit together, though neither of them could yet be certain of the full picture. Mary reached across the table and gently took his hand in hers. "I have prayed every single night for 30 years, she said softly, that the boy I failed to protect was somewhere safe in this world. If you are truly him, then God has finally answered an old woman's prayers before she leaves this earth." Thomas did not know what to believe, but something deep in his chest ached with a strange feeling of recognition that he could not put into words. He gently asked Mary if there was any way to prove who he truly was, and she told him of a small birthmark, shaped like a tiny crescent moon, that had been on the back of the missing boy's left shoulder, a mark that only those closest to the family would have ever known about. Slowly, Thomas removed his coat and shirt, and there, exactly where she said it would be, was the very same mark. Mary wept openly at the sight of it, covering her trembling mouth with both hands. She told him that he must go to the manor at once and speak with the Duke, but Thomas hesitated, feeling suddenly unsure of himself. He had no real proof beyond an old woman's fading memory and a birthmark that some might simply call coincidence. He feared being dismissed as a fraud, or worse, becoming a target for a family that may have once wanted him gone for good, and might still wish to keep the truth buried forever. Mary insisted, despite her frail health, that she would go with him to the manor. She declared firmly that she would not let him face the Duke alone, not after 30 long years of carrying her silence like a heavy stone. The very next morning, the two of them made the slow journey up the hill together toward the towering manor gates. Edmund Hawthorne received them in his private study, a grand room lined with old portraits of stern-faced ancestors staring down from the walls. He was a man in his 50s, with a guarded expression and tired eyes that clearly carried the weight of his family's troubled history. When Mary gently introduced Thomas and began to explain her story, Edmund's expression slowly shifted from polite skepticism to something far more complicated, a careful mixture of disbelief, quiet hope, and quiet fear. To their surprise, Edmund revealed that he himself had long suspected something was deeply wrong about the story of his grandfather's rise to the title. He explained that he had once found old letters hidden in the estate archives, letters written by his grandfather Richard to a trusted associate, speaking in careful coded terms about a problem that had been handled and a debt that would secure the family's future for generations. Edmund had never been able to make full sense of those strange letters, but hearing Mary's account now, the pieces of the puzzle began to take a far darker shape in his mind. He immediately called for the family's elderly physician, a man who had served the household for many decades, and who still kept careful medical records dating back several generations. After a careful and thorough examination, the physician confirmed that Thomas carried not only the crescent-shaped birthmark, but other distinct physical traits consistent with the Hawthorne bloodline, including a particular structure of the jaw and a rare blood condition that had quietly appeared in the family for many generations. Edmund sat in heavy silence for a long while after hearing the physician's careful findings. He was not a cruel man by nature, and despite knowing what this discovery might mean for his own position and title, he found that he wanted to know the full truth more than he wanted to protect what he already had. He ordered a complete and thorough investigation into his grandfather's old affairs, and over the following weeks, more pieces of evidence slowly came to light. A former servant, now very elderly and living quietly in a nearby town, bravely came forward to confirm that she had once overheard Richard Hawthorne arranging for the young boy to be quietly taken away and left with a family far from Ashbourne, paid generously to raise him, without ever revealing where he had truly come from. The long-buried truth, hidden for 30 difficult years, slowly came into the light of day. Richard Hawthorne, driven by deep jealousy and burning ambition, had arranged for his own brother's young son to be taken from the estate and left far away, ensuring that the family title and wealth would eventually pass down through his own descendants instead. The old Duke had spent the rest of his life quietly believing his beloved son was lost forever, perhaps even dead, never once knowing the painful truth of his own brother's quiet betrayal. Edmund, to his great credit, did not try to hide from this dark family history once it was finally confirmed beyond doubt. He gathered the family's solicitors together and began the long legal process of formally recognizing Thomas as the rightful heir. A careful process that would take many months, but that Edmund pursued without any hesitation. He told Thomas privately, during one quiet evening, that he had never truly felt at peace in his position, knowing that lingering questions about his grandfather's past had always remained unanswered in the back of his mind. He said that restoring the full truth mattered far more to him than holding on to the title itself ever could. Thomas, for his part, struggled deeply with the sudden weight of his new identity. He had spent his entire life as a simple fisherman's son, content with a quiet and humble life by the sea, and now he was suddenly being asked to become a duke's rightful heir, responsible for a grand estate and a complicated legacy he had never known existed. He spent many long hours speaking gently with Mary, who slowly became something of a grandmother figure to him during those difficult months, patiently helping him understand the family history and the painful past that had once been stolen from him. As winter slowly approached, Mary's health began to gently decline, but she lived just long enough to see Thomas formally recognized by the courts as the true and rightful heir of Ashbourne. On the day of the official ceremony, she sat proudly in the front row of the manor's great hall, warm tears streaming down her weathered face, finally free of the heavy guilt she had quietly carried for 30 long years. She told Thomas, just before she passed away peacefully a few months later, that watching him finally come home had been the single greatest gift of her entire long life. Thomas took on the new responsibilities of his position with quiet humility, often turning to Edmund for gentle guidance along the way. And the two men, despite the strange and unusual circumstances that had brought them together, slowly formed a genuine bond built on mutual respect and shared history. Edmund chose to step back from the dukedom, but remained close to the estate, patiently helping Thomas learn the many responsibilities that came along with his rightful birthright. The village of Ashbourne, which had whispered rumors and quiet theories for 30 long years, finally learned the true story of what had happened to the Duke's long-missing son, and the tale slowly became known not as one of tragedy, but as a story of an old wrong finally being set right after so many years. Years later, Thomas would faithfully visit Mary's quiet grave every single autumn, the very same season in which he had once disappeared as a small child, and the same gentle season in which he had finally come home for good. He often told his own children the touching story of the brave servant girl who had carried a heavy secret for 30 years out of simple fear, but who had finally found the quiet courage, in the end, to help him reclaim everything that had once been unfairly taken from him. It was, in the end, a story of patience, of guilt slowly transformed into redemption, and of a simple truth that no amount of time could ever bury forever.